You're listening to GWP News Nightly. I'm Anchorman Isaac Hedges, and our top stories tonight will be looking at some truly earth shattering information out of Venezuela, the latest on the conflict in Iran, and a new ruling from the Supreme Court. All that and much more coming up on GWP News Nightly. Well, folks, we thank you all again for tuning in to GWP News Nightly, and we thank you also, as always, for bearing with us through any of the technical difficulties that we encounter. Again, unfortunately, as you'll know, last night was one of those nights that we weren't able to get a newscast out. So, again, very unfortunate on that front, but we are glad to be back here in the swing of things tonight. Thank you again for bearing with us through all of that. In terms of other recent releases, we also have more frequent, as we mentioned the past few nights, more frequent updates from GWP Weather over with my co host Jacob Fulmer. Some excellent weather coverage across our region on that front that you will not want to miss out on. So, to stay up to date on the latest weather for our region, the latest news, the latest from the Great World podcast, all of the different things that we do here at Great World Productions, the number one way to stay up to date on to that is to subscribe to Great World Productions on YouTube. That's the Great World Productions channel on YouTube. And whenever you do that, there'll be an option to ring a little bell to receive notifications with each new release that we have, with each time we go live, anything like that. And again, whenever you subscribe, whenever you ring that bell, there'll be some different options for what exactly to be notified on. But again, a number of different great things there that you do not want to miss out on. You don't want to be left in the dark on that front. If that's not something you've already done, that's something you can do if you like right here below this video. So again, something you don't want to miss out on. In the meantime, a number of major recent events, and as we mentioned at the top of the show in our overview, from Venezuela, we have some truly earth shattering information. We say that, of course, because many of you have likely heard that there have been a couple major high magnitude earthquakes from the country of Venezuela. That is, in the country of Venezuela, of course. Now, we know that two powerful earthquakes of very high magnitude, as we mentioned, 7.2 and 7.5, struck Venezuela recently, and this was just within seconds. So, within seconds of each other, these two devastating, very high magnitude earthquakes struck. So, just very devastating effects on that front. And we don't have very robust numbers on that point on what exactly happened, what some of the effects were, just because it was so widespread, so severe, again, very high magnitude for an earthquake. And again, very recent, so not very solid numbers at this point, but according to the latest estimates, we've got at least 180 to 188 confirmed deaths, that is, in Venezuela after these couple of very severe high magnitude earthquakes. So, not even abundantly clear on that. They call it a confirmation, but the qualifier at least. So, again, that tells us it's likely more than the estimate, and the estimate itself is not a single number, not even a number for an estimate. It is 180 to 188, a given range for confirmed deaths. So, not abundantly clear how many exactly there were at this point, and the search and rescue efforts are still very much ongoing because this was so severe, so widespread. Again, still very much ongoing, just trying to find some of those bodies under the rubble. So, just terribly tragic after these couple of severe earthquakes in Venezuela. Now, some of the effects of that and what exactly happened, some of the destruction in their country. Now, the entire residential towers, that is, collapsed in Caracas and LaGuardia. Airport operations have also been understandably disrupted. This, of course, different from LaGuardia Airport in New York City. This, of course, LaGuardia, which is in Venezuela. So, an important distinction to make on that front. Now, the United States and international rescue teams are deploying U.S. Treasury authorized emergency relief transactions despite sanctions. So, again, historically have had not 100% perfect terms with Venezuela and the United States and our relations. So we've had sanctions for some time on the country of Venezuela, but we've made an exception for this natural disaster for their country, also a national disaster for their country. that, again, frankly, they don't necessarily have all the resources that they would need to make a full recovery from just all the death and destruction that happens. So, in spite of the sanctions that we have on Venezuela, it's still helping out with the recovery efforts on that front. Very fortunately, now, in terms of other information on that, some of the estimates, as we mentioned, still very much ongoing as search and rescue efforts continue. In terms of a recent estimate on that, the USGS has warned that fatalities could exceed 10,000. So, again, we've already had the confirmation 182, 188 at least are how many are confirmed dead, but not abundantly clear on that front. And they have that qualifier, notably, at least. It's still very early on, so likely that death toll will rise, sadly, as they find under the rubble more and more people. So, again, just terribly tragic. Certainly, the people of Venezuela could use your prayers. We will continue to follow that for the latest information here on GWP News Weekly, News Nightly, that is, as it is very much an ongoing, developing story. We will cover it, especially in relation to the United States involvement in it and some of the recovery efforts, as something you do not want to miss out on here on GWP News Weekly in our future editions. Now, in terms of other major recent events, one on an international level, that, of course, a major foreign war between the United States and Iran, a war which we have covered extensively in recent times here on GWP, something we covered back doing GWP News Weekly, something that we've even talked about perhaps on the podcast and different things like that, but just a number of major developments on that front, and something that's been going on for some time that started way back in February. Now, in terms of the latest developments on that, the White House now has formally requested $87.6 billion in supplemental funding, mostly for the Iran war. Now, funding includes $21 billion for munitions and industrial base strengthening. Democrats, though, criticize the request. They say that it fuels an unpopular war, is what they call it, while Republicans face a politically risky vote, of course, facing a challenge, having a slim majority in Congress, a majority, albeit a slim one, making things all the more difficult in this situation. Now, our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, met recently with Gulf allies, and technical talks with Iran are scheduled next week in Geneva. So, Marco Rubio, our Secretary of State, as we mentioned, met recently with Gulf allies. Some of these Gulf allies we mentioned recently, when we speak broadly, oftentimes in the context of the Iran war, the Iran conflict here on GWP News, about these Arab Gulf countries, again, which is what they're most known for, is exporting oil, exporting and selling a lot of oil all across the world. And naturally, the export path that they rely on involves the Strait of Hormuz, which has made it difficult for them, this whole conflict having at times the Strait of Hormuz blocked off entirely, not allowing these exports, creating a scarcity of sorts with oil, and in turn, sort of across the world, which we're even seeing, which we even have seen somewhat here in the United States, that influencing our oil prices and in turn influencing what we pay at the pump in terms of gas prices. Probably the most direct effect to the everyday Americans, how that may be affecting you, is gas prices. So naturally, when you've got a scarcity, that sort of jacks up the prices because the demand is still there. But again, there's suddenly a shortage. Suddenly, we've got to pay more to get this thing that's suddenly more hard to come by than it was in the past. So that's sort of being one of the major issues central to this conflict going in Iran, has been, as we mentioned, for some time, going on since February. Now, this funding, as we mentioned, includes that $21 billion for munitions and industrial base strengthening. The Secretary of State, as we mentioned, met recently with those Gulf allies, and those technical talks are scheduled with Iran next week in Geneva. So we will see how things shake out on that front. You will have to stay tuned to GWP News Nightly for all the latest on that. Something you do not want to miss out on. You will indeed have to stay tuned for that. We also know that Israeli strikes in Lebanon killed at least two people, straining the United States Iran ceasefire. So, sort of Israel for their part in that agreement. Again, primarily that ceasefire between the United States and Iran, but Israel, of course, playing a major role in this whole conflict. They're also part of that agreement. And sort of one of the terms in there sort of discouraged, sort of asked Israel not to go on with their strikes on Lebanon, something that they've done extensively. And well, it appears that they're continuing to do that, contrary to the contrary to the request of the United States in this most recently established ceasefire agreement. So again, one of the main concerns sort of going into this with the U.S. Iran ceasefire was if Iran would hold up their end of the deal, because we know that historically they've been real adversaries to the United States in terms of our relations. And we've even had in this very conflict multiple ceasefire peace agreements that haven't held. The terms just simply weren't adhered to. It simply just didn't hold up. Things are looking that way on that front, but we're now beginning to see sort of a difference, sort of a divergence in interest between the United States and Israel. As we covered this conflict from the very start, of course, Israel have a major role in it, having a major role in it from the very start. They, of course, a joint strike on Iran with the United States, of course, the Operation Epic Fury from the United States, in coordination with Operation Roaring Lion from Israel. But again, since then, sort of as this conflict has went on, another major development on that is our interests, the United States' interests, have begun to diverge from Israel's interests. So again, another issue beyond obviously the issues with Iran and the United States, sort of the historical relations on that front and how they play into relations and trustworthiness in the conflict in its current state, but a number of major recent developments on that front. And as we mentioned, the White House, this was on Wednesday, sent Congress that request for $87.6 billion in supplemental funding for the Iran war and some unrelated programs. Now, in addition to defense funding, there are a couple other things included in there. The White House is asking for billions as well to support farmers respond to the Ebola outbreak in Africa and to complete construction projects in Washington and New York City. Now, the Democrats quickly slammed this request, which would force Republicans, now vulnerable, of course, having a slim majority in Congress, a majority, albeit a slim one, having them vote on a widely considered unpopular war, is sort of what they're saying now, and spending on that. In terms of Congress's response, well, they would need to appropriate funds were they to fulfill the White House's request on that. Now, the White House on Wednesday asked Congress for that $87.6 billion, as we mentioned, in supplemental spending to pay for the Iran war and a host of a few other things, including aid to United States farmers and Ebola response. Now, the White House Office of Management Budget Director Russell Vought made a request in the letter to House Speaker Mike Johnson. He said, I urge Congress to take action on these important and urgent requests as soon as possible. That from Russell Vought. Now, the request includes $21 billion for the Defense Department to support critical capabilities, munitions procurement, and strengthen the U.S. industrial base. $1.4 billion for Ebola response, and $768 million for the Energy Department for nuclear and other energy security. Now, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in March said that the Pentagon may request $200 billion to fund the war that began February 28th. Now, again, this could request put Republicans already vulnerable with a majority, though albeit a slim majority in Congress, into a difficult position this months from the midterm elections. Again, not really rosy plans on that, not really rosy expectations on that front, that is, but again, that sort of tends to be the case widely. If these are things that you've followed historically, well, you know you'll be no stranger to this, and it isn't terribly surprising that the party with the president sitting in office when it comes to the midterms, when that president is still in office, well, the other party, again, tends to really really play up the issues with the present administration. And because of that, they tend to do better. They tend to beat out whatever the president's party may be in terms of that in Congress. So we'll see again with that slim majority if the Republicans will manage to maintain their majority. And things like this, things like the conflict in Iran being a major issue for voters that they'll be considering in this. Certainly something that we'll continue to follow here on GWP News Weekly. Another great thing that you will have to stay tuned for. So, again, as we mentioned, could be some difficulty on that front. Now, Votes Letter also requests, as we mentioned, $10 billion for farmers who have struggled in the last year and a half, in part because of Trump's trade policies, $500 million for restoration and construction projects in Washington, and $1 billion to renovate the Penn Station in New York City. So, just a couple of things included there. A couple of other things included in the new budget request from the White House. They say Congress has a constitutional obligation to provide for the common defense, and we must always sustain our military with the tools and capabilities needed to defend America in full force against all threats. House Appropriations Committee Chair Tom Cole, Republican from Oklahoma, and Defense Appropriation Subcommittee Chair Ken Calvert, Republican from California, said in a joint statement on Wednesday. So, those being the latest developments on the conflict in Iran, something again that we've covered extensively here on GWP. And for the latest on that, you will have to stay tuned. Now, in terms of other major recent events, a major decision coming down from the Supreme Court, that, of course, the United States Supreme Court coming down from a national level. It's ruling relating to immigration. That is a major immigration ruling from the United States Supreme Court. Now, the Supreme Court recently ruled a 6-3, allowing the Trump administration to end temporary protected status for Haitians and Syrians. Just a couple of the places from which some of those hail, again, coming into the United States, who don't assimilate historically. There's been some issues with, you will recall, the controversy in the past, especially surrounding the Haitian immigrants in the state of Ohio. The issues with sort of the cultural differences, again, and sort of what was alleged there was that they were eating the cats and dogs, which is not something that is customary here in the United States. Certainly for owners of cats and dogs, just a horrifying thing for again, pets, domesticated animals, just culturally a very strange thing to eat here in the United States. And what's more, was considered to be at the time, these cats and dogs that they were eating weren't necessarily their own. They belonged to sort of the citizens in that area that were having their pets eaten. So, just one of the fronts, again, where sort of it appears problematic taking in certain cultures, again, ones that don't necessarily mesh well with that of the United States. So that's sort of a major consideration in this ruling. Again, ruled in favor of ending temporary protected citizenship status for Haitians and Syrians here in the United States. Now, the decision overturns lower court orders and exposes hundreds of thousands to possible deportation. So, majority opinion says that courts cannot review DHS decision on temporary protected status termination. So, a major development on that. Now, in terms of the dissent, it's highlighted concerns about racial bias in the policy's origins. So, again, that's sort of being alleged there, sort of by the opponents to the ruling. Those in favor, naturally, of course, say it's not about that. It's not about race. It's about culture. Culture, of course, is related to race, is related to where you come from. Where you come from will have a distinct culture necessarily. But again, it's important in these things that these citizens, these immigrants, be able to assimilate into American society. So, some reasonable concerns there from either side on that front. This regarding the latest ruling from the Supreme Court. As we mentioned, this ruling from Thursday, which allowed the administration to end legal protections for migrants Again, whatever they're fleeing in other countries, that is sort of the speculation on that front in terms of why exactly they may come. Now, the 6-3 decision overturns, as we mentioned, that 6-3 decision overturns lower court orders and allows the Department of Homeland Security to swiftly end temporary protected status, a program that covers 1.3 million people from 17 different countries. So, again, marked a victory at High Court for Republican President Trump's sweeping crackdown on immigration. The conservative dominated court has put the brakes on some immigration policies. It handed him a second win Thursday in a decision, clearing the way for the revival of a policy again on this particular arrangement, this temporary protected citizenship status. So that's some of the latest information on that front. Of course, with the latest Supreme Court ruling and the conflict in Iran, along with the earthquakes that happened recently in Venezuela. So, more details to be known, more information to be had on that front that we will continue to follow here on GWP News Weekly. And we apologize again for getting the newscast out a little bit later than usual tonight, being a shorter version than usual. Again, any feedback on that you might have, we certainly would appreciate down in the comments below this video. You can always call in with any questions or comments that you might have at 417-448-0819 with any questions, comments, anything you'd like us to cover here. Anything of the sort, again, that's 417-448-0819. We would love to hear your thoughts. And with that, we conclude this broadcast. We thank you all again for tuning in. Till next time, I'm Isaac Hedges for GWP News Nightly. From all of us at GWP News Nightly and Great World Productions, good night and God bless.